this anarchy theme will begin to build, because we are locked in an impossible cultural bind between a completely exhausted and materialistic Marxism and a completely cancerous and value-dark kind of capitalism. Neither of these systems is tolerable, actually, and each feeds off the other as its reason for being. The problem has always been with anarchy that people, as W.C. Fields said, are no damn good. And I think that's where psychedelics come in. The reason people are no damn good is because they have no sense of social responsibility. And it is the cultivation of this sense of social responsibility that will pave the way for anarchy. And it isn't social responsibility as preached from the pulpit. It has to be from the guts. It has to be real social responsibility. And then, lo and behold, the withering away of the state and all these highly unlikely things will actually come into view. But it will take almost a sub-telepathic or proto-telepathic society for this to happen. Computer networking and that sort of thing can provide the hard wiring for the basic data, the banking data, the statistical data, the real unconscious of the machine part of humanity. But it's human beings that are going to have to make this leap to responsibility to usher it in. It's the completion of this program of obsession with the Neolithic. It's the completion of the program begun by psychoanalysis and psychedelic drugs, and a number of people who might not have thought they would end up on the same side. I mean, it's the completion of the program of Hugh Hefner and the feminists, because it will eventually, it does have this polymorphic sexual content, but it also is certainly a goddess realizing kind of social movement. This thing I said earlier about emotions are the carrier wave of being, and we have been blind to this for a very long time. There's going to be various political stances arise in relation to all of this stuff. For instance, one faction will say that nothing at all is wrong. This is, I think, what we see going on now, that there's a kind of collusion by governments and institutions to manage apocalyptic awareness, and to say, well, you don't need to worry about the fact that ozone is disappearing from the atmosphere, because by 2000 we will have a 7% reduction in output of CFCs, and by 2050 we're planning a further 7%. And you say, no, these are crazy people, obviously. There's a lot of arranging the deck chairs on the Titanic going on. But I think eventually that fluctuations, as the fluctuations become more violent, they will burst through, and political dialogues will start on various fronts. It's hard to say where it will come. For instance, historians of the breakup of the Soviet Union can reasonably argue that what actually the hole in the dike there was the Chernobyl explosion. And that actually set off a series of thought, of awareness. People's minds changed. It was like a psychedelic drug, this radiation spreading through Soviet society, because they realized, my God, this was a power plant. It was at ground level. It wasn't even a designed explosion. And 8 days after it happened, above Auckland, New Zealand, you could sample the radiation in the air. So there was a whole crisis of faith in the command economy, in everything. And this could happen, this will happen. The one thing you can be sure of is that the 90s will be shaped by the unexpected. Could be anything. A hot day in August in Mexico City and 1 million people die when finally all of these toxic levels come together as they potentially could. Or it could be a nuclear failure. Or it could be an assassination. Or it could be the outbreak of a synthetic disease. Or anything. You know, and what this will bring home to people is that the metastable nature of society is beginning to break down, that the shock waves of the future are building up. And what you know, in engineering an airfoil, engineers have to take account of what is called Q forces, vibration. If you don't design the airfoil correctly, as you approach the speed of sound, the wings of the airplane will be torn off. And so you have to redesign the airplane to move through this barrier. What we have to do is redesign the cultural airfoil so that we slip, what? What, you mean that it shouldn't support wrecking the third world? Pardon? No, see, I think that kind of thing is like talking about closing air bases near Sacramento and whether Western civilization can survive the shock of this loss of jobs. We're turning into an information society, and managers are trying to meet the crisis, but if my faith rested with human managers, I'd be frantic. The main thing is that the design process is being imposed by nature itself, just in the way that a supersonic aircraft has its design imposed by nature itself. The nature of the medium is dictating the shape of the society that is coming into being. The main thing is to try to make this through with as little bloodshed and hysteria as possible. And it's a very hard call. I mean, looking at something like Bosnia, you know, the impulse to use F-18s to correct the problem is very great. And yet, you know, in the past, this has not brought joy and thanksgiving where it was used. And also the hubris of thinking that your job is to separate these people. On the other hand, we can't have people running around trading nuclear weapons in the red light district of Frankfurt, and which is going on. This is actually going on. There is a great potential for chaos on the Eurasian landmass right now. How should that be managed? And, you know, a lot of people have nuclear weapons who have no business having nuclear weapons. I think we need to disarm from the top. That's a political agenda. And one thing that has to be understood is that what is going on is a process of fragmentation. And that is what is supposed to happen at this cultural stage, I think. McLuhan talked about what he called electronic feudalism. Wherever fragmentation is resisted, violence and war and horror will break out. For instance, you know, 5 years ago there was great anticipation of a federal Europe. That ran against the current of dissolution. And now we see there won't be any federal Europe. I mean, there'll be something on paper in Brussels to keep the diplomats shuttling back and forth. And there'll be no unified psychology. They're going tribal. The great political force shaping the 90s on one level is ethnicity and turf battles. As these huge ideologies withdraw their imperium,
all these local satrapies and warlords begin to exercise their historical claims. Islam is set to make enormous gains. This has to be accepted in the West. It shouldn't be resisted. The historical momentum is too great, and it's 700 million people, and it represents the only reservoir of tradition of significance left on the planet. In terms of a political agenda, I mean, it's pretty clear. The psychedelic thing speaks to freedom, and so you can shine that on a number of issues: women's rights, abortion, legalization of drugs, but not absolute libertarian anarchy, because I don't think we want to get rid of the Food and Drug Administration. We may want to execute the top echelon and replace it, but the concept of, I've lived in a country without a pure drug act, and it's a nightmare. In India, you can't buy pepper without being afraid that it's been contaminated with lead flakes to make it weigh more when you buy it in the market. Well, but we've all had, none of us ever had a psychedelic experience in a safe environment. I mean, we come out of the nightmare ages. I took psychedelic drugs under the aegis of Richard Milhous Nixon. I mean, I've stared archetypal danger in the face. I took psychedelics under Indira Gandhi. That was... The bottom line is that we're in the roller coaster. The little pipe has now been dropped into your lap. Please do not stand up. Scream if you want. Hang on, and we'll come through it. But we have to reassure people, and the way you reassure people is by getting them to transcend the systems which are spreading the anxiety. I mean, if you're a fascist, if you're a capitalist, if you have some vested interest in the system, then you're going to be sweating blood. And you have to divest yourself of a commitment to the system, because it's in a process of transformation. Most people have almost, Ward Cleaver type values and worlds that they move in very comfortably. Cyberspace, gene therapy, virtual reality, nanotechnology, interstellar travel, life extension. These things enliven the experience of reading the newspaper, but they don't come tangential to most people's lives. On the other hand, some people, the technical community that's creating these things, the cadres of media people who must understand and re-explain this stuff back to the general public, they breathe and eat this stuff. And some people, like myself, I guess, are ambivalent go-betweens between it. Human beings have always existed sociologically and aesthetically and conventionally over a much broader spectrum of behaviors and attitudes than any other species we're familiar with. But that difference has undergone like a hyperinflationary explosion in the last 15 years, largely because Well, no, there are so many reasons, gender redefinition, the rise of the internet, the emergence of the super rich, the emergence of the super poor, the emergence of the totally wired, the emergence of the totally disconnected, and also the awareness that the growing sophistication of propaganda, which makes all honest efforts to establish a level playing field of discourse easily subverted. I mean, every time you think you're having an honest discussion or making an honest appraisal of a situation, if you pull back one level, you discover you're embedded in other people's agendas and other people's and institutions' styles of manipulating reality. I mentioned to you Eric Davis's book. It hasn't come out yet, Technosis. When it does come out, I urge you to read it for all kinds of reasons. One I would mention here is that it showed me that everyone, including myself, and that is the big shock for me, is a creature of their time, and that it's very hard not to serve invisible agendas where you don't realize that you think the way you think for reasons entirely divorced from who you are, where you are, and what's good for you. For example, in the Middle Ages, Christian piety permeated every level of society and every act and every thought, even of the critics of Christian piety. It wasn't that there were people who stood apart from it. If you defined yourself by attacking it, you nevertheless were defined by it. I think I mentioned recently or somewhere or sometime that back when I was a student at Berkeley, once during a riot, people dropped a banner off a third floor dorm balcony that said, it was a quote from Jean-Paul Sartre, "We cannot transcend Marxism until we transcend the conditions that have created it." And in a way, we cannot transcend the social, political, and philosophical reality that we are now very uncomfortably situated in until we transcend the conditions that create it. But we are those conditions. The momentum of our ideologies is the main thing holding together the illusion of any coherency at all. I mean, the people who are really with it are really difficult to understand, and their effort to communicate is maddeningly unsuccessful, I think, for them and for us. The balkanization of discourse, the proliferation of special vocabularies, the generation of unstated professional assumptions, the we all know kind of sense of reality out of which then statements can be made, tends to island discourse. And yet, if discourse is islanded, community becomes nearly impossible. Well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. It seems to me, the conclusions that we've drawn from these meetings that we've had, which themselves have been plagued by this kind of fragmentation and dissipation. I mean, people have Feldenkrais things to do. They have processing to do. They have to meet their connection. They have something else to do that busts up their loyalty to even the idea of 6 consecutive meetings on the subject of chaos.
They're living it.
Yes, no, we're living it, but the important thing is to realize that you're living it and that that's what it is. What I come away from all this with is that looking at the future, much of which is already in place. I mean, don't imagine that the world will look greatly different in 5 or 10 years. It may look slightly different. This world we're living in, the world of 1998, to the camera's eye, is indistinguishable from the world of 1990. And yet, the most elaborate and sophisticated technical artifact in the history of mankind has been put in place in those 8 years, the rise of the internet. But, who runs into it? Who stumbles over it? Who sees it? It's odorless, tasteless, invisible. We all had computers in 1990. It's simply that they were large paperweights. Now they have become telepathic creatures. And while we natter over the implications of all of this, they freely converse with each other in a planetary-wide environment and evolve themselves toward, whatever destiny lies in wait for the machine logos that we have pulled into existence. So, this future which is already here has implications that few of us have fully grokked, I think. And I listed 3 of them just as a crib to help me through this. First of all, that there is no closure. All ideology is now exposed as an adolescent response to being. If the 20th century taught us anything, it taught us the toxic nature of ideology. The excesses of the left led to the Holocaust. The excesses of the right led to the pogroms and mass trials of Stalinist Russia, the excesses of the Cultural Revolution in China, the suppression of dissent in many parts of the world. So there is a need to abandon ideology, which is really a postmodern position, and it's very uncomfortable. The absence of closure is a post-juvenile stance toward being that few people in the past ever lived long enough to grow comfortable with. If you died at age 40, culture as a con game lasts long enough to keep you entranced up until sometime in midlife. If you live beyond midlife and you still are fascinated and entranced by culture, chances are you're an idiot of some sort. I mean, is this not obvious? After the this is why marketing has shrewdly understood this. This is why we are folded back toward the idolization of youth, because it's an idolization of cluelessness. It's not the firm body and the quick step that the marketers are interested to sell you. It's innocence. But innocents are people you love to play poker with if you are sufficiently cynical. And believe me, the market forces are sufficiently cynical. So assimilating to the future means living not with no ideology whatsoever. Or with, and people say, well, can one live without ideologies? Isn't the belief we should, strive for peace and justice and ideology? I don't think so. I think these are provisional models of behaviors that derive from immediate practical concerns that can be revised in real time, constantly held up to the incoming flow of data and adjusted. That's why the concept model is somewhat, if Lenin had said he had a model, if Hitler had said he had a model, I think it would have played out with a little more soft conclusions than to say, a new truth is proclaimed and the behaviors which derive from it are incontrovertible. So no ideological closure. And I don't know how you feel about this. I'm very comfortable with it. I was passionate about ideology in my youth. I've had most of them. At 11, I was reading Mein Kampf, and Festung Europa sound like a very good idea. I loved all that pseudo-Egyptian, overscale, tasteless architecture and all that stuff. Folk dancing and summer camping sounded attractive. At 17, I was a Marxist, ready to go to the barricades for the workers' state. At 22, we marched under the black flag of anarchy, used to bust up meetings of Trotskyites and write graffiti on their front doors and make life hell for those people. Now I don't give a shit, and I feel much better about it. Thank you. I think we should strive for a sane and caring world that gives as many people as much choice to express themselves as possible. Beyond that, I don't feel any kind of an imperative. I think worry is preposterous. That was Weipo Yang, a 6th century Chinese Taoist sage, said that. Worry presupposes that you understand what's going on. And I think it's safe to say that we do not have a clue as to what is going on. We can't even tell whether it's a happy ending or a catastrophe. We can't tell whether we're slamming into the wall of our cultural limits at 50,000 miles an hour, or we're about to go hand in hand off to the galactic center with the human soul as companion and vehicle. We just do not know what's going on. I think it's safe to say that we're approaching a symmetry break. That whether you're a horrified pessimist or a gung-ho optimist, everybody can see that the make or break point is coming up, because life is either going to get a lot drearier suddenly, or there's going to be some kind of a breakthrough. Well, I'm not worried. I think that what is happening is a transformational process, not the bankruptcy of ideology, not the spin down of technical civilization. I'll argue through much of tomorrow and tomorrow evening that history is not our fault, that you no more can blame us for the shape of human history than you can blame a fetus for the unfolding morphology within the womb. That history is the necessary distortion of an animal species to lead it to the brink of an ontological transformation. When we get into this issue of politics, it's a very tricky issue, I think, to handle from a psychedelic point of view, because the psychedelic point of view, as I read it at a fairly deep level, is that it's a done deal. It's okay. Basically we're going to make it. We've been on a straight line vector for millions of years with this transcendental attractor that has shaped us, called us out of matter, and is revealing itself through us. But knowing that is not permission for sitting on your can, or ceasing to participate in the struggle to create a just and caring society. It does mean that you shouldn't worry, that worry is off the menu, that you don't know enough to worry is one of the arguments to be made. So I think it's basically a case of we need to act locally and think not simply globally, but cosmically. And in our cosmic ruminations, struggle to erase boundaries and to see that, the difference between us and the next species in waiting in the evolutionary elevator, and the difference between life and death, and the difference between pre and post history, these are differences that can be easily erased. And when they are, what comes through is this lost sense of unity and purpose and rightness that we're trying to recapture.
Liberate yourself from the illusion of culture. Take responsibility for what you think and what you do. And then the other political implication toward community is a lot of people are going to be very anxious because change raises anxiety in people. And people who have limited opportunities to educate themselves because of culturally inflicted abuse are scared because they can sense that everything familiar is giving way, but they don't want to embrace the unimaginable. These people need to be reassured. They need to be reassured by example and by hearing optimistic and reasonable rhetoric about the future. Selling the future as an 8-alarm fire, which is how the media does it, only makes a sane future impossible. So we need a responsible approach to thinking about the future. And it means taking personal responsibility for your drug taking, for the ideas, the memes that you push into society, and for the images that we share among ourselves. One of the great truisms of the New Age is that images can heal. But I've never heard anybody discuss the obvious contra-implication, which is images can make you sick. And you are constantly bombarded with images which disempower, divide, confuse, and make crazy, basically. So I think the reason psychedelics are such political dynamite in any culture is because they dissolve cultural assumptions. The scales fall from people's eyes, and they say, does this make sense? Does my job make sense? Does my relationship make sense? To my significant other, to my government, to my children, to my environment. Do these relationships make sense? And of course, the answer for most people in high-tech society is no. We've been compromised, we've been deluded, we've been sold a massive pottage. The way out, then, is personal responsibility, new operating systems downloaded from outside of culture, which means from the deeper wisdom of the psychedelic plants, and then a commitment to community and a motto of to the future without fear. Without fear. Thank you very much.
Over the years, I've always taken the position that basically nothing need be done. That, there is I'm an agnostic religiously, which is what can you show me
position. But I've always had the feeling that the universe was put together in such a way that it would work out all right in the end. And have, from my days in the Berkeley underground, I've got a very healthy suspicion of leaders and plans. I mean, I'm even more caustic on the subject of political leaders than I am on the subject of gurus. But nevertheless, well, this is a subject which is very hot in our household, which is the world getting better or is it getting worse? And is there anything that we personally can do about it? And because it's always been my feeling that it was all taken care of from hyperspace, and that it would all make sense in the end when the historical culmination became visible to all the participants, I've taken the position that the real political frontier is ourselves, reconstructing our attitudes, molding ourselves to be as caring, loving, and conscious as we wish that our leaders would be. Nevertheless, the culture crisis is intensifying. There's plenty of evidence that things are getting worse in a hurry. Things like what I talked about last night, the burning of the Amazon, the rise of the greenhouse effect, so forth and so on. So it seems to me there are political options. There are positions that need to be taken that are not being taken. There are answers, even if you are not a transcendentalist, even if you don't believe in the inevitable working out of human history to the satisfaction of everyone. And when you begin to talk politics, you inevitably brush the subject of responsibility and permission. What kind of responsibilities do we have to each other, to the planet, to the future? What kind of permission can we take from each other, from the planet? What is to be done and what can be done? And I wanted to talk a little bit about this morning, some ideas that we'll throw out, basically to get your feedback. It's a little different take than the psychedelic ranger sort of position that you may be used to hearing. The psychedelic movement of the 1960s had no political agenda, really. I mean, Tim Leary's agenda was turn on, tune in, drop out. And the war was a side issue where the New Left made common cause with the psychedelic people, and the war was eventually ended. But the psychedelic movement went nowhere except underground. And I think this was largely because they disdained to set real-world political goals that non-psychedelic people, and let's face it, probably 95% at least of the human race is non-psychedelic. Non-psychedelic people needed an agenda to relate to. And even in my own life, I have a kind of a tendency not to want to dabble in politics, not to want to propose concrete solutions because they are easily subverted, easily attacked. They create factionalism, which I think is a bad thing. But nevertheless, I think there are arenas and theaters of political action that are not being articulated that we could take more seriously. And I want to talk about a few of them fairly briefly, and then hopefully we can have a dialogue about this. The first question being, is it necessary at all to have a political agenda? Are we not perhaps becoming frightened by the intensifying of the historical crisis to the point where we doubt our own previous point of view? Or
if you think it is necessary to have a political agenda, then what sort of agenda should it be? And I want to start with the most immediate and practical possibilities first, and then move towards some of the more long-range and globally impactful possibilities. Last night we talked about the destruction of the rainforest in Brazil. A very obvious political first step to halting what is going on with the destruction of nature in the third world is to get the international lending community to exercise a degree of moral responsibility. In other words, it's a shocking notion to suggest that the International Monetary Fund only support ecologically sound projects. And yet it seems to me obvious that this should be done. It isn't the Brazilian government that should be blamed for the clearing of the Amazon or the land-hungry Brazilian peasantry. It's the IMF and the World Bank, because they pay for it. They make the multi-billion-dollar loans that make this kind of thing possible. Banks are amenable to political pressure. If their dirty laundry were shrilly laundered in public, they would have a public relations problem that would force them to rethink what they are doing. There was an article in the New York Times about 5 days ago about how world capitalism, big capitalism, is finally actually alarmed by the greenhouse effect because it's hitting their investment. We live in the world, but there are agencies that think they own it. And when they see that their investment is threatened, and that's how they analyze it. These people don't love wild animals and climaxed rainforests. They love money. And when they see their investment threatened, I would think they could be pressured to revise their loan policies. Another step that it seems to me lies directly ahead of us in the future that I do not understand why it isn't more discussed, and can only conclude somewhat lightheartedly, because I don't like being a paranoid, that there must be a conspiracy against what I am about to propose, a conspiracy run by governments. And that is, the international boycott is potentially a tremendous tool for problem solving. But to date, it has been so gutted and watered down that it becomes no more than a gesture. The world today is a global whole. It is very tightly webbed together and spun into itself, one part into another. Let's take the case of South Africa, which I hope with this crowd is a fairly uncontroversial case. Everyone is waving their arms saying something must be done about South Africa. It's a barbarian situation. It's intolerable. And the notion of a boycott as presently practiced is that General Motors will take 18 months to cut its investment there in half. And then this is hailed as a great step forward. But in fact, the financial and political machinery is in place to make life hell for the government of South Africa. If you are serious about changing the policies of a government, you don't threaten to withdraw your investment over 4 years. You say, look, there will be no mail. There will be no telephones. There will be no international banking transactions. You're through. We're just pulling the plug on this scene. And I guarantee you, you would get action. There is no reason why mail should be delivered to that country. There is no reason why telephone service should be maintained with these people, and it is inexcusable to loan them a single dime, obviously. And, choose whatever problems scattered around the world irk you particularly. Northern Ireland, Israel, Iran-Iraq war, territorial encroachments going on in Africa. If these people were just told no money, no phone, no mail, no trade, nothing, it would, and I believe that this isn't done because every government fears that if the machinery to apply tools like this were in place, it might eventually be their turn. And no country wants to face that because that's serious. You can't go forward. They're just calling in the chips when they do that. So this is something which, rather than feeling totally powerless, we should all advocate the tremendous strengthening of the notion of international boycotts. This is very useful. Not a shot needs to be fired. And it goes without saying, weaponry should be withheld from these people. Spare parts, technology, engineers. These South Africans should not be sending their people to our engineering schools. In fact, their passports shouldn't be honored anywhere. They should be invited to go home and live in their wonderful society if they think it's so great. And they can forget about phoning New York or getting mail from New York and Paris.
But you're suggesting this originally here as an ecological, as a technique for leaning on the situations that are laying waste.
I think it can be applied to like the Brazilian situation, the South African situation, Wars cannot be fought without an influx of capital, materiel, and information. It's obviously something that people would favor, that governments would oppose. And so I've never heard any politician of any stripe, from Gorbachev to Bush, suggest that the strengthening of the machinery of international boycotts would be an obvious first step toward putting this planet on a reasonable course.
There are a lot of things going on. The collapse of Marxism was really the collapse of everything, because Marxism and capitalism were balanced against each other like a house of cards. In the absence of any intellectual critique of capitalism, capitalism has asserted itself with a vengeance. And what we see happening in the world, what the New World Order is a new corporate order. And some things about it are good and some things are bad. For instance, when the world was ruled by nation-states driven by ideologies, and remember that was as recently as 7 years ago, when the world was ruled by nation-states driven by ideologies, war was a frequent instrument of national policy. Racism was tolerated as a reflection of national identity. Nuclear arsenals and a mutual standoff in that area was tolerated. Suddenly, now, a new gang is in charge. Marxism is gone. Racism in the institutionalized form known as apartheid is gone. Trade barriers are being lowered all over the world. And if you look at governments in the United States, in England, in France, Germany, and Japan, they are universally, and Italy, they are universally characterized by being staffed and run by jackasses. In other words, high caliber talent isn't going into government. Government is a place where the Jesse Helms of this world hang out. And when was the last time an official of the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund felt the need to threaten the life of an American president? It won't happen. Those people are heavy hitters. Only a hysterical, powerless yahoo would behave that way.
I had a lot of trepidation about this conference and about my speaking. I had even a brief moment of hope that the war would cancel it, because I wasn't sure what it would be like to talk to a group of people while robot bombs are falling on our enemies around the clock. I just couldn't picture that. So normally I just sort of take flight and whatever's on my mind gets splattered onto your mind. But I don't feel so certain of myself in this situation. I'm not sure that just taking flight for another evocation of the psychedelically aided evolution and transformation of our species is the way to go. Because I think maybe we should, or I should, attempt something that's a little rare for me, plain talk about what's going on. Yesterday, Bob Wilson got up and talked about the war, and then Tim cheered him on and put his stamp of approval on that. I thought it was great. And then we broke, and somebody cornered me for an interview, and they said, "What's with these guys dragging politics into this thing? This is not a political meeting." I didn't say anything. I just tried to assimilate that. And then last night I thought about it, and I've been thinking about it, about this war, about the 60s, about Vietnam, about how LSD played a major role in stopping that war by forcing people to confront what they were really doing, by empowering people to get together in large groups and say, "We won't stand for it. We won't put up with it." And even though the war is now 2 weeks old, whatever it is, for the first time, really last night, I got why it feels so bad to me personally, and by extension, I think, to all of you. Aside from all the horrors of war, which you have had rehearsed for you over the past 2 weeks, what really is a pisser about this is that it means for people my age and older, they didn't hear us. We weren't heard. When they were bombing Libya, we could just call that an aberration. When they were hunting down Noriega, we could just call that a large dope bust. This is none of those things. This is war. And what we said, if you can take the psychedelic and political struggles of the 1960s and boil it down into one phrase, what did we stand for? We stood for making love, not war. And ever since the Marines were shoved into the sea at Da Nang and the CIA was helicoptered off the embassy roof in Saigon, we've been able to hold a delicate and very tense balance between the view of the dominator, weapon-worshipping, old-style macho approach to things, and our own. And I think we all felt, I certainly did, last August when they began to move the chess pieces around, that we would not stand for it, that there was a we, and that we would not stand for it. And if
you were able to keep your idealism intact until the congressional debate, when you felt then they represent us, they will stop it. After all, it's the opposition party to the administration. It's an anti-war party. They will stop it. And they went like sheep to the slaughter. To the slaughter. And they voted for it. So now we have no excuse. No faction was overridden. Nobody's rights were trampled on the path to this debacle. We, the people of the United States, by some staggering percentage, approve of this. Well, so that's to people like myself and Tim Leary and Bob Wilson and John Lilly and all the people who aren't here and all of you that I've grown up with and worked with, this is an abomination. We stand for consciousness expansion. Do you know how much shit you have to have for brains to wage war? It staggers the imagination. We stood for deconditioning, asking questions, resisting authority. Today, no questions are being asked. Authority is not being resisted. Oh yes, there are demonstrations against the war, but in a democracy they have what's called a 5% rule. It doesn't matter if only 5% are involved in it. It doesn't matter what it is. So we have been effectively isolated. Our names have been metaphorically signed to the bottom line of these documents that commit us to war. How do you feel about that?
The other thing is, we don't have to be polite. We don't have to be polite. I remember at Berkeley in the 60s, the first time, I was a wide-eyed freshman, and I took a big survey course in anthropology that had people of all, freshmen, sophomore, juniors, and seniors in this class. And there were, and this professor, some gray-bearded, great, hoary with wisdom, was holding forth, and somebody stood up and said, "Bullshit." And you could just hear a pin drop. And then somebody else stood up and said, "Yes, this is bullshit." And it's like the emperor's new clothes. The whole thing begins to unravel because so much BS is being slung. So, it's hard to know where to draw the line, but I think we need to be very, very critical of our institutions. I hate this whole Clinton thing because I don't like people who walk around assured that now the world is safe. At last, the 4-term governor of Arkansas has taken the helm. We need worry no more. Well, my God, do you know what you have to be the 4-term governor of Arkansas? What a blood-soaked gangster creep you have to be to ascend through that. Do you know what you would be like if you had been governor of Arkansas 4 terms? Can you even wrap your mind around the concept? And then this is the liberal hope. This is the great white hope. This is the good guy. God forbid we should say anything about the bad guys. And not to knock Bill Clinton, he's just some clown trying to stumble through. But if this is people's idea of radical social reform, if this is people's idea of putting in place, imagine, we need to limit the Earth's population, back down male births, legalize psychedelics, get rid of atomic weapons, move to a hydrogen economy, so forth and so on. And when they suggest closing an air base near Sacramento, the California papers are full of articles about whether Western civilization can survive the shock or not. Get real, my friends. There are shocks on the way that will make closing an air base not even register on the meter. The way money is spent in this country is really obscene. There was a breakdown of weapons in the paper about a week ago in an effort so that the ordinary person in the street could understand what's going on. The stealth fighter, is it the F-18? The F-18A sitting there on the runway costs $110 million. You know what you can buy if you have $110 million on the civilian market? You can buy the Trump princess. That's what the Trump princess cost.
Publicity about your acquisition of the boat this summer. The Princess, is that what I call it?
I bought a boat from Adnan Khashoggi, which was formerly called the Nabila. And
Nabila.
It's a yacht. And
Adnan Khashoggi, excuse me for a second, is the world's largest arms trader?
I hate to admit it.
Well, now we think of Trump as just the exemplar of obscene wealth. I mean, this guy, what a pig, all this money. All of his money buys him one F-18A. We build these things by the dozens, dream of selling them by the hundreds. So, is Donald Trump a pig? What about, there are levels and levels. Some people make an easy target. The amount of money being spent on armament as opposed to the amount of money being spent on anything else, the cure of disease, housing, education, you name it, is totally schizophrenically skewed.
I keep the engines off as much as possible, but it's a substantial...
Has a swimming pool on it?
It's got a swimming pool.
And a pizza oven?
It's got just about everything, including pizza.
Could you...
He makes me feel very guilty about this, folks. And I like to do other good things.
See,
I have to end up...
No, you shouldn't feel guilty about this because, I mean, you've worked hard for this money, or reasonably hard. I mean... I don't see you doing a lot of heavy lifting, but,
I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said, men are men, but man is a woman. And if you really want to do inner work, if you really want to go to the core of why the world is so screwed up, it's because the male ego is just run riot. And feminism as a political agenda, as a horizon of transcendence, has only begun to be explored. I really think that it's impossible to stress enough how important it is to feminize the planet and to feminize ourselves. It's hard to put it across to people because even people think that they have dealt with this issue, and they say, well, we always go Dutch. What are you talking about? That's not what I'm talking about. There really has to be a recognition of the fact, and this gets me into more controversy. Everything leads to controversy, I suppose. But I really feel that monotheism is a horrible error, a nightmarish misunderstanding. Not bad as a philosophical position, I mean, the drive for unity, but even a phrase like drive for unity is so laden with male chauvinist assumptions that you have to wonder. Monotheism presents us with a model of God that is all-powerful, all-knowing, omniscient, and not to be questioned. Well, you don't have to have spent much time reading Jung to realize that our gods are images that give us permission concerning how we construct our personalities. And if you meet someone who is all-powerful, omniscient, omnipotent, and never wrong, you're dealing with a horse's ass of some sort. Because nobody is like that. And yet that is the personality model that we are given permission to exemplify. And all men, or I don't want to say all men, but most men, including myself, go whole hog for this, and most women also. This talk about empowering women, it to me is saying make them more masculine. We don't need to empower anybody. We have enough. The problem is to disempower the creeps that have all the power, not to hand the power over to some other group. So I think that the real planetary transformation of all the political institutions, and this would solve the problem of feeding people. Women do not sell their breast milk to their children. It would solve the problem of destroying the earth. Women rarely set their houses on fire. It would solve the problem of war. War is abhorrent to women. This is why giving them political power has always been such a touchy thing, because they might try to grab the rules and change the rules of engagement. And women are present to wash the bodies of the dead, to give birth to new people. They're always there at the nitty-gritty. And men, through the accident or design of biology, play a somewhat peripheral role in things. The proof of this is the parthenogenetic adaptations of lizards where there are no males. It was so ancillary that it was eliminated. So be forewarned as we enter the era of genetic engineering. And the pre-monotheistic model was philosophically messy, I grant you. It was that there were many gods and many goddesses. All of nature was alive. It was bathed in mystery. Its measure could not be taken. And birth and death and migration, all these things came in their time. It was a kind of Taoistic recognition of the plurality of being, of the multiplicity of being. And then this fusion into the male-dominated family and the emergence of language in a species with a male hierarchy has just created a tremendous empowerment of the male ego. And we're not talking about the guys hanging out down at the pool hall. I deal with people all the time who define themselves as enlightened, cleared, and so forth, and they're carrying around immense amounts of male chauvinism and unexamined attitudes in the way they behave. And some of you who were at Ojai may have heard me say, a man may be a fool and not know it, but not if he's married. And this is a clue as to where spiritual guidance should come from. We've run it for 15,000 years, so now why not just stand slightly aside and listen with a slightly greater degree of attention? This will then give permission for this nurturing kind of mothering morphogenetic field to make its impact felt, rather than this divisive, sharp-edged, competitive kind of model. This thing that I'm always inveighing about ego is, I think, very true. We are so similar that any one of us could stand in for any of the other of us. So this thing we spend our entire life creating, called my unique personality, is a yuppie indulgence, just like the BMW and the Picasso print and all the rest of it. Nobody is really special. Intelligence is special when compared to stupidity, but no one holds the patent on intelligence. And I don't believe that intelligence is something that you're born with. Intelligence is something that you learn. Everybody starts out stupid, and it's just some people remain that way because of the failure to inculcate curiosity. Curiosity is the great virtue. And the reason I'm into psychedelics to the degree that I am is because I'm interested in the world. And it's taken me in many, many directions, from tropical butterflies to rocket building to paleontology to surrealism to tantra to psychedelics. And the reason I'm not giving a lecture somewhere in the world today on butterflies or tantra is because psychedelics are more interesting than those things. Each thing is a step to something else. You know, when you talk to shamans, psychedelic or otherwise, there's a lot of emphasis on what they call the way of the ancestors. And this is a good New Age phrase, and it sort of has a vaguely furry and friendly sound to it. But what is the way of the ancestors really? To my mind, the way to think about yourself is that you are the front end of a genetic shockwave moving through the genetic environment. And if, as I sit and talk to you, I scratch my head, and let's assume I am pest-free for a moment, then this gesture is part of the way of my ancestors. You know, I had a grandfather, a great-grandfather, a second cousin who did this. Everything about you is inherited. Nothing about you is uniquely yours, unless you have some lethal mutation that has sprung into being in your lifetime and is probably going to plant you. But everything serviceable about you is inherited from the past. So not only are we not different from each other, but we are not different greatly from the people who preceded us. And on a scale of 10,000 years, the differences are minuscule to non-existent. So part of the political awareness that comes out of psychedelics is the defocusing of the sense of self, strangely enough. And people, this is a tricky message to put out, because people say, well, are you saying then that we should be perfectly comfortable in some kind of human anthill? Is this a kind of crypto-fascist idea? I don't think so. It is not true that the finest achievement of Western civilization is the democratically empowered individual ego. That is not the finest flower of our civilization. The finest flower of our civilization, to my mind, is the ideal of charity, community, and a generalized sense of human dignity that is often somewhat limited in its expression in other societies. I mean, when Pakal went to his tomb, if you read the description in The Forest of Kings, at the end of a very elaborate ceremony, and almost as an afterthought, his inheritor sacrifices 4 captives before he climbs back up the stairs. And it's almost like oh my God, we've had this 2-hour ceremony, I've been wearing this jade pectoral, I'm sweating like a pig, now I have to kill 4 people before I can take a shower and change clothes, and then he does it. This is not a society where the generalized values of human worth and community were very highly expressed. Okay, so that's one point. Then this other point, which is more my special. I mean, I feel uncomfortable preaching a dogma of moral awareness because I'm perfectly aware that my behavior could not survive any kind of thorough scrutiny at all. And I revel in it and seek not to change. I figure warning people is all you have to do. You don't have to reform your character.
It's a fun listen to you. What you're saying is pure Dzogchen.
Oh, good. I'm glad there's some traditional backing. But the other point that I wanted to make, and this is my personal opinion, but held fiercely, is that the real, if we say that psychedelics expand consciousness, then we mean something more than just that you're aware of the gradients of color or the subtleties at dinner in conversation. What expansion of consciousness means in a historical framework is ideas. Civilization and uncivilization have all been built out of ideas. Urbanism, monotheism, the sum of the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the square of the other 2 sides, the keyed arch, the ratchet, the pulley, ideas. And again, I would challenge you, as we look at the 20th century, where are the ideas that the psychedelic community can lay clear claim to? Was Einstein loaded? Was Marx? Was Freud? Were the people who fractionated DNA the first time? Were the people who went to the moon? Were the people who propounded fascism? You know, where are the ideas? We cannot move, and I think I said this in one of my other lectures, we cannot move any faster than the language that we evolve, and we cannot move into the future any faster than the ideas that we generate. And right now, in the aftermath of the collapse of Marxism, no critique is being carried out of the dominant ideology that rules the planet, which is market economics, capitalism, consumerism. There is no coherent critique being brought forth against these things. Now, we have a fragmented opposition to the reigning paradigm of the marketplace. And the opposition names itself various ways. There's feminism. There's anti-racism. There is ecological consciousness. And there is psychedelic awareness. To my mind, one of the great failures in the political dialogue at the end of the century is that these groups of people have not made common cause. Why is it so hard to explain to a feminist why they should be an ecologist? Why is it so hard to explain to both of those parties why they should take psychedelics? The opposition to the reigning paradigm of market economy and product fetishism is woefully fragmented. You know, what does gay rights have to do with racism? What does that have to do with the destruction of the rainforest? And what does that have to do with the manufacture of unnecessary products with toxic byproducts? Well, the answer is everything. Everything. Because what we're talking about here is the quality of the human experience of the living world. And you know, John Donne said, every man's death diminishes me. Every person's suffering diminishes your happiness. I personally have found it in the last several years, and I don't know whether it's because of my personal circumstance or the larger picture, but it becomes harder and harder to take very large doses of psychedelics because there's a part of the trip which I call the world news. And the world news is hard to put up with. And the visions, the images of the forced rape concentration camps in Serbia, the distended bellies of the children of Somalia, and then intercut with the vast and mindless wealth of the high-tech industrial democracies. It's a picture of human self-hatred and mismanagement, and the consequences are global. Every man's death, every person's suffering diminishes the quality of human experience generally. How much misery can there be in the world before no one can take psychedelics? Because it simply inducts you into an awareness too horrible to contemplate. Well, I don't have the answer to this, but I think that these other groups of people, the people who are disturbed by racism and sexism and environmental destruction, what we can bring to this dialogue is more than a persuasive argument. Because if persuasive arguments could carry the day, then the Sermon on the Mount would have marked the turning point, or, you know, Gandhi or somebody else. What we bring is an actual pharmacological intervention into the unconscious side of the human experience. I think the reason shamanism endured for 500,000 years without generating profane history is because it created a sense of self-worth in people that caused them to not need to build enormous earthworks or enslave other people or even carve jade and wood, because the inner worth was felt to be sufficient. We are the most individually impoverished people the world has ever known. All our self-worth comes through social status, ownership of things, the size of our bank account, so forth and so on. So I think we need to demand of ourselves a greater political awareness and a greater willingness, and I'm not faulting this group because I think we're at the cutting edge here, but a greater willingness to stand up and be counted. The dominator paradigm has us locked into where we are pleading for our right to take psychedelics. This is, and then we say to ourselves in some of our conversations that the Holy Grail would arrive if they would allow us to take psychedelics. This is a cockamamie notion. They should be pleading for an exemption from the obligation to take psychedelics and be connected into the Gaian mind. Tim Leary said an amazing thing years ago, or at least I say he said it. Once I tried to give him credit for it and he denied he'd ever said it. But whoever said it, it was brilliant. They said, LSD is a psychoactive compound which occasionally causes psychotic behavior in people who have not taken it. This is truth for sure. And we are surrounded by people who exhibit all kinds of psychotic behaviors because they have an inner conviction that they are mad. And they're right. This is what the fear of psychedelics is rooted in, I think, is the people who are truly embedded in dominator values say, I wouldn't touch that stuff. You know, I don't want to explore my psyche. I don't want to know who I really am. I don't want to connect up to our historical legacy or the state of the earth. Damn right they don't, because they understand that it would be almost more painful than could be borne. And to a degree, we are infected with this same thing. One thing about psychedelics is that they make you feel the situation. Well, but who could feel the situation and not be bummed? You know, if everybody on Earth could suddenly tap into the way things feel terrible. Epidemic diseases, great wealth in the presence of great poverty, the roaring extinction of species, the endless mills of propaganda. The situation doesn't feel very good. And so as consciousness expands, the news is not all good news. I think there's an inner core of humanness that is still uncorrupted. But 1,000, 5,000 years of practicing dominator-style social systems and ideologies has left us with very little room to maneuver. Well, I think what you're implying is we're designed to defend small tribal groups of people in a hunting-gathering situation, and we're crowded into cities by the millions, and does this increase violence? And the answer is, it's a contributing factor. But I encountered an old friend recently, and I asked him, what have you been doing? And he said, I founded something called the Rocky Mountain Center for the Study of Media Violence. And he explained to me something which I had never understood, because you always hear that violence in media is used to sell things. But none of us are violent people. We're all turned off by violence. So how is violence used to sell things? He said, well, how it works is in the evening news, which is where all the ad revenue is made, because that's where most local stations are most watched, the most violent, disgusting, and value-denying and denigrating story is pushed right before the main commercial break. And so your desire to get away from this horrible information is satisfied when the cut is to the product, and there is an unconscious flood of relief associated with the product. We are being manipulated. We have created social institutions such as consumer capitalism that are so unfriendly to our innate humanness that they are actually redesigning us, these social systems, to be more brutal, less caring, more acquisitive, more fetishistic than we naturally would be. And again, the antidote to this is awareness of your immediate environment and the trips that are being run on you and the ways in which we are being manipulated. Man is not bad. Humanity is not flawed. What is flawed are ideologies and social systems that distort humanness for purposes usually of commerce or conquest. And until you figure out that this is going on, we're all going to be run like rats through a maze. Culture is an intelligence test, and when you pass that test, you don't give a shit about culture.